The cold wind cut through the thin blanket wrapped around Solara's shoulders as she sat at the edge of the cliff, staring at the gray sky above. Her legs, once strong enough to carry her through the dense forests of her homeland, now lay motionless beneath her. They were useless, dead weight that reminded her every moment of what she had lost. 6 months had passed since the battle that changed everything, and the memory still burned in her mind like fire that would not go out. She had been a scout commander in the Eternal Forest's defense forces, leading a team of 12 warriors who trusted her with their lives. They called her the Swift Wind because she could move through the trees without making a single sound. Her arrows never missed their target, and her strategy had saved countless lives during the border conflicts. The Elven High Command had praised her, and her family had been proud. She had everything an elf could want in their long life. Then came the ambush near the western border. The Crithian Empire had sent their shock troops through a hidden pass that no one knew existed. Silara's team had been the first to encounter them, and she had immediately sent warning signals back to the main forces. The battle had been fierce and chaotic. Energy weapons lit up the forest like lightning, and the smell of burning wood filled the air. Solara had fought like never before, taking down enemy soldiers one after another while directing her team to safety. But then she saw one of her warriors, a young elf named Mira, who had just joined their unit surrounded by 3 Crithian soldiers. Without thinking, Solara had rushed forward to help. She managed to kill 2 of the enemies, but the third one fired an energy blast that caught her in the lower back. The pain had been unlike anything she ever experienced. It felt like her spine was being torn apart from the inside. She fell to the ground, unable to move her legs, unable to feel anything below her waist. Her team had carried her back to the medical center, where the healers worked on her for 3 days straight. They tried everything they knew, every spell and remedy passed down through generations. But the energy blast had done something that their magic could not fix. The nerves in her spine were destroyed completely, and even the most powerful healing could not bring them back. The head healer had told her family that she would never walk again, that she would spend the rest of her very long life unable to use her legs. That was when everything changed. Her family, who had been so proud of her achievements, stopped visiting. Her mother came once to tell her that it was better if Solara understood the reality of their situation. In Elven society, physical perfection was not just valued, it was expected. An elf who could not walk, who could not contribute to the defense of their lands, was considered broken. Her mother had cried as she explained this, but she did not argue against it. That was simply how things were. Her military unit was even worse. Her former commander, General Theron, who happened to be her uncle, came to see her with official documents. He told her that she was being stripped of her rank and expelled from the service. When she asked if there was any other role she could fill, perhaps training new scouts or planning strategy, he had looked at her with something like pity mixed with disgust. He said that the sight of her would damage morale, that soldiers needed to see strength, not weakness. He gave her 1 week to leave the Eternal Forest. The Dragon Council had been just as harsh. They demanded that Ember, her bonded dragon companion since she was 50 years old, be reassigned to a new rider. Dragons were too valuable to waste on someone who could not fight, but Ember had refused. The crimson-scaled dragon, smaller than the great war dragons but fierce and intelligent, had roared her defiance at the council elders. She made it clear that she would never accept another rider, that her bond with Solara was for life. The council had been furious. They declared that both Solara and Ember were exiled, sent to the Forgotten Reaches where outcasts went to die with whatever dignity they could find. They were given minimal supplies, just enough to last a few weeks if they were careful. No one expected them to survive longer than that. The Forgotten Reaches were harsh and unforgiving, with little food and extreme weather. Most exiles died within the first month. Solara and Ember had been there for almost 5 months now. They survived by hunting small animals that Ember could catch, and by drinking from a stream that ran through the rocky valley below their cave. Solara had learned to drag herself across the ground using her arms, her useless legs trailing behind her. It was exhausting and humiliating, but it was the only way she could move. Ember helped when she could, carrying Solara on her back when they needed to travel longer distances, but the dragon was growing weaker too. There was not enough food here for a dragon, even a small one. Some days Solara wondered why they kept fighting to survive. What was the point of living like this, abandoned and forgotten, slowly starving in the wilderness? But then she would look at Ember, at the dragon who had given up everything to stay by her side, and she knew she could not give up. Ember believed in her even when no one else did. Even when she did not believe in herself. The sound of footsteps on rocks made Solara reach for the knife she always kept nearby. Visitors were rare in the Forgotten Reaches, and they were almost never friendly. She turned her head to see a figure climbing up the path toward their cave. It was a human man, wearing the gray uniform of the Human Alliance military. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with short dark hair and a face that looked tired. He carried a pack on his back and moved carefully as if he did not want to startle her. Ember growled low in her throat, positioning herself between Solara and the stranger. The dragon's scales began to glow slightly red, a warning that she was ready to attack if needed. But the man stopped about 20 feet away and raised his hands to show he was not holding any weapons. He called out that he meant no harm, that he had seen their campfire from his outpost and wanted to make sure they were all right. His voice was calm and steady, not threatening. Solara studied him carefully. She had fought alongside human soldiers during joint operations before her injury, and she knew they could be just as proud and prejudiced as elves. But this man did not look at her with disgust or pity. He looked concerned. She told him they were fine and did not need help from anyone. Her voice came out harsher than she intended, but she was tired of charity and false sympathy. The man nodded slowly and said he understood, but then he pointed out that they both looked half-starved, and he had extra supplies at his outpost that he could share. No strings attached, no expectations. He said his name was Jake Morrison, and he was stationed at a monitoring post about 2 miles east of here. Solara wanted to refuse. She wanted to tell him to leave and never come back, but her stomach was empty, and she could see Ember's ribs showing through her scales. Pride would not keep them alive, so she agreed to let him bring some food but made it clear that she did not want his pity. Jake smiled slightly and said that was fair enough. He promised to return the next day with supplies. True to his word, Jake came back the following afternoon carrying 2 large packs filled with food. There were dried meats, fresh vegetables, bread, and even some fish that dragons loved. Ember's eyes lit up when she smelled the fish, and despite her distrust of humans, she could not help but edge closer. Jake set down the packs and stepped back, giving the dragon space. Over the next few weeks, Jake kept returning with supplies. Each time he came, he would stay a little longer, talking to Solara about simple things. He told her about his work at the monitoring post, about the equipment he maintained that tracked Crithian ship movements. He told her about his family back on Earth, about his sister who was studying medicine and his father who had been a builder. He never asked her about her past or her injury unless she brought it up first. He treated her like a person, not like a broken thing to be pitied. Slowly, carefully, Solara began to trust him. She told him about her life before the injury, about being a scout commander and the pride she had felt in serving her people. She told him about the ambush and the pain of being abandoned by everyone she had ever known. Jake listened without judgment, and when she finished, he simply said that her people were fools for throwing away someone so strong. Solara had laughed bitterly at that. She asked how he could call her strong when she could not even walk. When she had to drag herself across the ground like an animal, Jake had looked her straight in the eyes and said that strength was not about walking or running or fighting. Strength was about surviving when everything tried to break you. Strength was about waking up every day and choosing to keep going, even when it would be easier to quit. By that measure, he said, she was one of the strongest people he had ever met. Those words stayed with Solara long after Jake left that day. No one had ever defined strength that way before. In elven culture, strength meant physical power and combat skill. But maybe Jake was right. Maybe there were different kinds of strength, and maybe she had more of it than she realized. As she sat in the cave that night with Ember sleeping beside her, Solara felt something she had not felt in months. She felt hope. 3 months had passed since Jake first brought supplies to the cave, and life had changed in ways Solara never expected. The human engineer visited almost every day now, bringing not just food but tools and materials he claimed were spare parts from his outpost. He was building something, though he kept it secret until it was finished. One morning, Jake arrived with a wide smile on his face and a strange contraption strapped to his back. He set it down carefully in front of Solara and stepped back with obvious pride. It was a chair with wheels, but unlike any chair she had seen before. The frame was made from lightweight metal that gleamed in the sunlight, and the wheels were large with thick treads that looked like they could handle rough terrain. There were handles and levers attached to the sides, and the seat was padded with soft material. Jake explained that he had spent weeks designing and building it specifically for her. The wheels were powered by a small energy cell that he had modified from monitoring equipment, so she would not tire herself out pushing it manually on difficult ground. The controls were simple enough that she could learn them quickly. He had even added storage compartments underneath for carrying supplies. Scilara stared at the wheelchair for a long moment without speaking. Part of her wanted to refuse it, to say that she did not need his charity or his pity. But another part of her, the part that was tired of dragging herself across rocks and dirt, wanted to try it desperately. She looked up at Jake and saw no pity in his eyes, only hope that his gift would be useful. So she nodded and let him help her into the seat. The first time she moved the control lever and the chair rolled forward smoothly, Scilara felt something break loose inside her chest. It was freedom, small and limited perhaps, but freedom nonetheless. She could move on her own again without exhausting herself or relying completely on Ember. Tears ran down her face before she could stop them, and Jake pretended not to notice as he adjusted the settings and explained how to maintain the energy cell. Ember watched all of this with great interest. The dragon had been suspicious of Jake at first, growling whenever he came too close to Scilara. But over the weeks that suspicion had faded into something like acceptance. Ember had never liked humans before, considering them loud and clumsy compared to elves. But Jake was different. He was quiet and careful, and he always brought fish for Ember along with supplies for Scilara. More importantly, he made Scilara smile again, something the dragon had not seen in many months. One afternoon, while Jake was checking the wheelchair's mechanics, Ember did something completely unexpected. She walked over to him and lowered her head, pressing her snout gently against his shoulder. It was a gesture of trust and affection that dragons only showed to those they truly accepted. Jake froze in surprise, then slowly reached up to stroke the scales on Ember's neck. The dragon rumbled with contentment, and Scilara watched in amazement. In all her long life, she had never heard of a dragon showing such fondness for a human. But strange things were happening beyond just Ember's growing attachment to Jake. Scilara had begun experiencing vivid dreams that did not feel like dreams at all. They felt like memories, but not her own. She saw vast fleets of ships moving through space, their hulls black as night and covered in strange symbols. She saw worlds burning, their surfaces turning to ash and then to nothing. She saw darkness spreading across the stars, consuming everything it touched and leaving behind only empty void. At first she thought these were nightmares caused by stress and malnutrition, but they grew stronger and more detailed with each passing night. She began to see specific places and hear voices speaking in languages she did not know. The visions always came when she was close to Ember, and they grew most intense when she touched the dragon's scales. One night the vision was so powerful that Scilara woke up gasping for air, her heart racing. She had seen an ancient temple carved into a mountain, with massive doors covered in dragon symbols. Inside the temple was a chamber that held something terrible, a crystalline object that pulsed with dark energy. Just looking at it in the vision had made her feel sick and afraid. Around the crystal she had seen the remains of dragons, their bones arranged in a protective circle as if they had died guarding it. She told Jake about the visions the next day, expecting him to think she was losing her mind. But Jake listened carefully and did not dismiss her words. He asked detailed questions about what she saw, especially about the fleets and the symbols on the ships. When she described them as best she could, his face grew serious. Jake returned to his outpost and came back hours later with printouts and data files. He spread them on the ground in front of Scilara and pointed to images captured by his monitoring equipment. The ships in the images matched exactly what she had seen in her visions. They were Crithian vessels, but not the normal military ships. These were larger and equipped with technology that Jake had never seen before. More disturbing was the fact that his equipment showed massive fleet movements happening across multiple sectors, far more ships than the Crithians had ever deployed at once. Jake had contacts in the intelligence community, people who still trusted him even after his demotion. He reached out to them through secure channels and asked what they knew about the unusual Crithian activity. The responses he got back were troubling. Several colony worlds had gone completely silent in recent weeks, with no distress signals or evacuation warnings. When scout ships were sent to investigate, they found nothing. The worlds were simply gone, leaving behind no debris, no radiation, nothing to indicate they had ever existed. Solara felt ice run through her veins as Jake explained this. It matched what she had seen in her visions, the darkness that consumed everything and left only void behind. She closed her eyes and placed her hand on Ember's scales, trying to understand what the visions were showing her. This time she focused on the crystal, on the feelings and thoughts that came with seeing it. Information flooded into her mind, not in words, but in pure understanding. The crystal was called the Void Heart, and it was not a weapon created by any living race. It was a key, a lock, something that held back a dimension of pure nothingness that hungered to consume all existence. Long ago, before even the elves had reached the stars, an ancient race had nearly destroyed everything by trying to harness the void as a power source. The dragons, young then but already wise, had fought to seal it away. They had broken the key into pieces and hidden them across the galaxy, then encoded the knowledge of their locations into their very genes so that it could be passed down through generations. Ember was descended from those ancient dragons, from the first brood who had saved the galaxy once before. The memories were in her blood, waiting to be accessed by a rider who was worthy. That was why Solara could see them now, why the bond between her and Ember had deepened to the point where they could share not just feelings, but actual knowledge. The Crithians had found some of the pieces. They thought they had discovered a superweapon, something that would let them dominate all other races. They did not understand that the Void Heart was never meant to be used, that activating it would doom everyone, including themselves. And according to the ancestral memories flowing through Ember, one of the final pieces was hidden somewhere in the eternal forest, in the very land that had cast Solara out. She tried to explain all of this to Jake, struggling to put the wordless knowledge into language he could understand. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing more grim with every detail. When she finished, he asked if she was certain about this. Solara placed both hands on Ember's neck and felt the truth of the memories resonate through their bond. She told him yes, she was completely certain. Jake immediately tried to contact both the Human Alliance Command and the Elven High Council. He sent detailed reports through every channel he had access to, marking them as urgent and including all the data his monitoring equipment had gathered. He explained about Solara's visions and the connection to dragon ancestral memory. He warned them about the Void Heart and what would happen if the Crithians assembled all the pieces. The responses he got back were crushing. Human Command dismissed his report as speculation based on unreliable sources. They reminded him that he had been demoted for insubordination and suggested he focus on his assigned duties. The Elven High Council did not even respond directly. Instead, a low-level clerk sent a message stating that they did not accept communications from exiles or their associates, and that any further attempts to contact them would be considered harassment. Solara felt a bitter anger rise in her chest as Jake showed her the rejection messages. Her own people would not even listen to a warning that could save their lives, simply because she was the one delivering it. Pride and prejudice were more important to them than survival. She had saved elven lives for centuries as a scout, but now that she could not walk, her words had no value. Jake sat beside her wheelchair, his own frustration evident on his face. He said they could try going through unofficial channels, reaching out to retired officers or sympathetic politicians. But Solara shook her head. She knew her people too well. Once someone was declared broken and exiled, they became invisible. No one with power would risk their reputation by associating with her. The journey into the eternal forest was harder than any of them expected. Jake had designed a special harness system that allowed Solara to ride safely on Ember's back, strapped securely so she would not fall even during flight. The wheelchair was packed away in storage compartments that Jake had built on either side of the harness. It was ingenious engineering, but it took time to adjust to the new arrangement. Ember had to learn how to fly with the extra weight distributed differently than she was used to. Solara had to learn how to balance herself and communicate with Ember through touch alone, since she could not grip with her legs the way she once did. Jake rode in a smaller seat behind Solara, holding navigation equipment and weapons in case they encountered trouble. The first few flights were clumsy and frightening, but gradually they found a rhythm that worked. They flew mostly at night to avoid detection by elven patrols or Crithian scouts. The forest below them was vast and dark, stretching for hundreds of miles in every direction. Solara had spent decades learning these woods, but now she saw them differently. From above, the forest looked like a living organism, the trees forming patterns that shifted with the wind. Ember's ancestral memories helped guide them toward their destination, pulling them forward with an instinct that felt like magnetism. On the third night of travel, they spotted a campfire in a clearing far from any elven settlement. Jake suggested they investigate, thinking it might be hunters or travelers who could have useful information. Solara was reluctant, not wanting to interact with anyone who might recognize her or report their presence. But Jake argued that they needed to know if there were Crithian forces in the area, and the only way to get current intelligence was to talk to people on the ground. They landed in the trees near the clearing and approached cautiously on foot, with Jake pushing Solara's wheelchair through the underbrush. As they got closer, they realized this was no ordinary campsite. There were at least 20 people gathered around multiple fires, and they were a mix of different species. Elves sat beside humans, and there were even 2 Crithians among them, though they wore civilian clothes rather than military uniforms. A tall human woman with short gray hair noticed their approach and called out a warning to the others. Immediately, weapons were drawn and pointed toward the tree line where Solara and Jake waited. Jake raised his hands and shouted that they meant no harm, that they were just travelers looking for safe passage through the forest. The gray-haired woman studied them carefully, her eyes moving from Jake to Solara in her wheelchair to Ember, who waited in the shadows behind them. After a tense moment, the woman lowered her weapon and told the others to do the same. She introduced herself as Linda Hayes, former commander of the Human Alliance 3rd Fleet. She invited them to come closer to the fire and share their story. Solara and Jake exchanged glances, uncertain how much to reveal, but decided they had little choice. They needed allies, and this group might be their only option. Around the fire, Solara learned that everyone in this camp was an outcast like herself. Linda Hayes had been dishonorably discharged for evacuating civilians during a military operation, choosing to save lives over following orders that would have left thousands to die. The elves in the camp had been exiled for various reasons, from practicing forbidden magic to questioning the decisions of the High Council. The humans had been court-martialed or rejected by their own people for refusing to participate in actions they considered immoral. One woman caught Solara's attention immediately. Her name was Maya, and she was a human medic with cybernetic implants running along her arms and neck. She explained that she had been a brilliant doctor who developed technology that could heal injuries previously considered permanent. But when the military tried to force her to weaponize her medical knowledge, to create diseases and poisons instead of cures, she had refused. They stripped her of her license and cast her out, but not before she managed to steal some of her own research and equipment. Maya looked at Solara with professional interest and asked about her injury. Solara explained briefly about the energy blast and the paralysis. Maya nodded thoughtfully and said that under different circumstances, she might have been able to help. The cybernetic technology she developed could potentially bypass damaged nerves, but she no longer had access to the facilities or resources needed for such complex procedures. Still, she offered to examine Solara later to see if there was anything she could do to ease pain or improve circulation. Another member of the group was an elf named Kieran, thin and pale with eyes that seemed too large for his face. He explained that he had been a healer in the Elven Medical Corps, but he practiced what the High Council called blood magic. It was an ancient form of healing that worked directly with a person's life force, and it could cure things that normal magic could not touch. The problem was that blood magic required sacrifice, usually from the healer themselves. Kieran had given years of his own life force to save others, which was why he looked so aged and frail despite being relatively young by Elven standards. The High Council had declared his practices forbidden and dangerous, exiling him before he could teach others his methods. As the night wore on and trust slowly built between them, Linda Hayes asked Solara and Jake what brought them into the forest. Jake looked at Solara, silently asking if they should tell the truth. She nodded and began to explain about the visions the Void Heart and their mission to find it before the Crithians did. She expected skepticism or disbelief, but instead she saw recognition dawn on several faces around the fire. Linda stood and walked to her tent, returning with a data pad covered in notes and images. She explained that her group had been tracking strange Crithian movements for months, trying to understand their ultimate goal. They had noticed the disappearing worlds and the unusual fleet deployments. They had even intercepted some communications that mentioned something called the Void Heart, though they had not understood what it meant until now. But Linda had more disturbing information to share. She told Solara that there were rumors within the Resistance Network about a conspiracy involving elven leadership. Some high-ranking elves were apparently working with the Crithians, though no one knew why or what they hoped to gain from such an alliance. Linda had dismissed these rumors as paranoid speculation until now, but Solara's story made them seem more plausible. Kieran added his own piece to the puzzle. He said that several months ago he had been approached by an elven general who wanted him to create a poison that would cause permanent nerve damage without leaving obvious traces. The general claimed it was for use against enemies, but something about the request had made Kieran uncomfortable. He had refused and reported the incident to the High Council, which had promptly exiled him for practicing blood magic. Looking back now, Kieran wondered if his exile was punishment not for his healing methods, but for refusing to help create that poison. Solara felt her blood run cold as Kieran described the general who made the request. It had been Theron, her own uncle. The pieces began falling into place in her mind. Her injury had not been an accident or bad luck. She had been targeted deliberately, probably with a weapon specifically designed to cause the kind of damage that could not be healed. But why would Theron want to cripple his own niece? And what did it have to do with the Crithians and the Void Heart? Linda suggested an explanation that made terrible sense. If Ember was descended from the first brood and carried ancestral memories about the Void Heart's location, then Solara was a threat to anyone who wanted to use the weapon. By crippling her and forcing her into exile, Theron had believed he was neutralizing that threat. He probably thought she would die in the Forgotten Reaches, taking Ember's knowledge with her. What he had not counted on was Jake's intervention and Solara's stubborn refusal to give up. The group spent the rest of the night planning their next move. Linda insisted that her people would help them reach the Temple of Eternal Flame, which was where Ember's memories indicated the Void Heart piece was hidden. She had about 30 fighters in her resistance network, all of them experienced soldiers despite being outcasts. They might not be enough to fight off a major Crithian force, but they could provide protection and support. Maya packed medical supplies and insisted on coming along, saying that someone needed to watch over Solara's health during the journey. Kieran also volunteered, explaining that his blood magic might be useful if they encountered magical defenses at the temple. Jake was grateful for the help, but warned everyone that this mission would be dangerous beyond anything they had faced before. Anyone who came along might not come back. Linda smiled grimly and said that everyone in her group had already been declared dead by their former societies. They had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. If the Void Heart was activated, they would all die anyway. At least this way they could die fighting for something that mattered, trying to save a galaxy that had abandoned them. Over the next few days, the group moved through the forest together, a strange collection of outcasts united by shared rejection and common purpose. Solara found herself warming to these people in ways she never expected. They treated her with respect and did not see her wheelchair as... The battle began at dawn, when the first energy blast struck the rocks near where Linda and her fighters had taken cover behind ancient stone pillars. The Crithian soldiers had spotted their position and opened fire without warning. Linda shouted orders to her team, directing them to spread out and find better defensive positions. Jake grabbed the handles of Solara's wheelchair and pushed her toward a cluster of large boulders that would provide cover from the incoming fire. Solara's hands moved quickly to the weapons mounted on the sides of her chair. Jake had modified it over the past week, adding mounting points for rifles and energy weapons so she could fight effectively even while seated. She raised one of the rifles and began returning fire with precise accuracy. Her hands might not be able to make her walk, but they had lost none of their skill with weapons. 3 Crithian soldiers fell before they could reach better cover. Ember launched herself into the air with a roar that shook the mountain. The dragon's scales blazed bright red as she swooped down on the enemy forces, breathing fire that turned their advanced armor into molten slag. The Crithians had brought anti-aircraft weapons specifically designed to counter dragons, but Ember was faster and more agile than the war dragons they had trained against. She twisted and dove through the air, avoiding their targeting systems while raining destruction on their positions. Maya and several other resistance fighters pushed forward toward the temple doors, trying to reach them before the enemy could regroup. But then elven soldiers emerged from the forest on both sides, surrounding Linda's forces in a deadly crossfire. These were not regular troops, but elite guards wearing the silver and blue colors of General Theron's personal unit. They moved with deadly precision, their arrows finding gaps in armor and their magic shields deflecting return fire. Silara's heart sank as she recognized several faces among the elven soldiers. These were warriors she had trained with, people she had considered friends before her exile. Now they were trying to kill her without hesitation or mercy. She wondered what lies Theron had told them to make them follow him into this betrayal. Did they know they were helping the enemy? Or did they believe they were protecting elven interests somehow? The fighting grew more intense as both sides realized this was not just a skirmish, but a battle that would determine the fate of the galaxy. Linda's resistance fighters were outnumbered, but they had experience and desperation on their side. They had survived being cast out by their societies, and they had learned to fight dirty when necessary. They used the terrain to their advantage, setting traps and ambushes that took down enemy soldiers who had superior weapons and armor. Kieran moved through the chaos like a ghost, his pale form seeming to flicker in and out of visibility. He was using blood magic to create illusions and confusion among the enemy ranks, making them see threats that were not there and miss targets that were right in front of them. The cost was visible on his face, which grew more gaunt and aged with each spell he cast. Blood magic required life force, and Kieran was spending his own years to protect his companions. Then a voice rang out across the battlefield, amplified by magic so everyone could hear it clearly. Silara recognized it immediately. It was General Theron, her uncle, calling for a ceasefire. He emerged from the tree line surrounded by guards, his armor gleaming and his expression calm. He looked directly at Silara and told her to surrender, saying that this fight was pointless and would only result in more deaths. Silara shouted back, asking why he had done this, why he had betrayed his own people by working with the Crithians. Theron's face showed no shame or guilt as he explained his reasoning. He said that the elven race had been stagnant for too long, hiding in their forests while younger races like humans expanded and grew stronger. The Crithians had offered the elves a partnership, a chance to use the Void Heart as a weapon to eliminate humanity and reclaim their rightful place as the dominant species in the galaxy. He told Silara that her injury had been necessary, because Ember posed a threat to their plans. Dragons could not be controlled or deceived, and Ember's ancestral memories might have revealed the conspiracy before it could succeed. By crippling Silara and forcing her into exile, Theron had believed he was protecting the greater good of their people. He seemed genuinely puzzled that she did not understand or appreciate his vision. Jake shouted that Theron was insane, that using the Void Heart would not destroy just humanity, but everything, including the elves themselves. But Theron dismissed his words as human propaganda. He said the Crithians had assured him they knew how to control the weapon, that their scientists had studied the fragments extensively and found ways to direct its power. As if summoned by the mention of Crithians, another figure appeared on the battlefield. He was tall and imposing, wearing black armor covered in rank insignia. He introduced himself as Admiral Vex, commander of the Crithian Expeditionary Force. He walked casually through the combat zone as if bullets and energy blasts could not touch him, and indeed they seemed to pass through him without effect. It was some kind of personal shield technology, far beyond anything the resistance fighters had seen before. Admiral Vex congratulated Theron on keeping Silara and her companions busy for so long. Then he revealed something that made everyone stop fighting for a moment. He explained that he did not actually need to capture the Void Heart fragment from the temple. His forces had been planting resonance beacons at every location Silara had visited over the past weeks. These beacons tracked the unique energy signature emitted by the Void Heart pieces and transmitted their locations back to the Crithian fleet in orbit. The Admiral said that within the hour, his ships would simultaneously retrieve all the remaining fragments from their hiding places across the galaxy. Once assembled, the Void Heart would be activated remotely, creating a cascade effect that would consume this entire sector of space. Everything within 1,000 light years would simply cease to exist, leaving behind perfect emptiness that the Crithian Empire could reshape as they saw fit. Theron's face went pale as he realized what this meant. He stammered that this was not the agreement, that the weapon was only supposed to target human worlds. Admiral Vex laughed and told the general that he was a fool for believing Crithian promises. The Empire had no intention of sharing power with anyone. The elves would be consumed along with the humans, along with every other species in this sector. The Crithians would then move in to colonize the empty space, creating a pure empire with no other races to compete with or resist them. The elven soldiers looked at each other in confusion and growing horror. They had been told they were fighting to protect their people, but now they learned they were helping to destroy everything their ancestors had built. Several of them lowered their weapons and stepped away from their positions. Theron shouted orders at them to hold formation, but his authority was crumbling as the truth became undeniable. The battle erupted again, but now the sides were different. Some of the elven soldiers turned their weapons on the Crithians, realizing they had been betrayed. Others remained loyal to Theron out of habit or fear. The resistance fighters pressed forward toward the temple, knowing they had less than an hour to find and secure the Void Heart fragment before it was too late. Maya led a small team toward the temple doors while the others provided covering fire. She was fast and agile, dodging between cover points with medical supplies bouncing on her back. But a Crithian sniper had been tracking her movements. The energy blast caught her in the side, punching through her body armor and dropping her to the ground. She screamed in pain as her cybernetic implants sparked and failed, the technology shorting out from the electromagnetic pulse carried by the weapon. Linda and two other fighters dragged Maya back to cover while Kieran rushed to her side. The elf placed his hands over her wound and began channeling his blood magic, using his own life force to stabilize her injuries. Maya's breathing steadied and the bleeding slowed, but Kieran's face became almost skeletal as years of his life drained away in moments. He looked up at Linda and told her to get Maya somewhere safe, that he had done all he could. The battle raged on and more people fell on both sides. The resistance fighters were holding their ground, but barely. They needed to reach the temple soon, or Admiral Vex would win by default when his fleet retrieved the fragments. Celera looked at the massive doors and then at Ember circling overhead. An idea formed in her mind, desperate and dangerous, but possibly their only chance. She called out to Jake and told him her plan. She would merge her consciousness fully with Ember, accessing not just the ancestral memories but the complete power of the first brood. It was a process that ancient dragon riders had used in times of desperate need, but it came with a terrible cost. The merger was permanent and could destroy her mind if she was not strong enough to handle the flood of information and power. She would either become something greater than she had been, or she would lose herself completely. Jake grabbed her hand and begged her not to do it, saying there had to be another way. But Solara knew there was no time for alternatives. She could see more Crithian troops arriving in the distance, and Admiral Vex was preparing some kind of large weapon that would probably destroy. The transformation was complete, and Solara felt power flowing through her that she had never imagined possible. She was still herself with all her memories and personality intact, but now she also carried the wisdom and strength of countless dragons who had lived and died over thousands of years. Through her connection with Ember, she could sense every dragon across the galaxy, feel their hearts beating in rhythm with her own. She sent out a call that echoed across space itself, not in words but in pure emotion and need. It was a cry for help from the first brood, a summons that no true dragon could ignore. Across dozens of worlds, dragons lifted their heads in response. Some were bonded to riders, while others lived wild in remote places. Some were old and tired, while others were young and eager. But all of them heard the call and understood what it meant. The sky above the temple began to darken as dragons arrived from every direction. They came alone or in pairs, their scales reflecting every color imaginable. There were massive war dragons that could carry entire squads of soldiers and tiny swift dragons no bigger than horses. They circled overhead in a growing spiral, their combined roars shaking the mountain itself. The Crithian soldiers on the ground looked up in terror at the sight, realizing they had made a terrible mistake. Admiral Vex remained calm despite the approaching swarm of dragons. He activated the weapon he had been preparing, a massive energy cannon that had been hidden under camouflage netting. The weapon charged with a high-pitched whine that hurt everyone's ears. He announced that his fleet in orbit was already retrieving the other Void Heart fragments, and that nothing could stop the activation sequence now. Even if the dragons destroyed his ground forces, the weapon would still trigger within minutes. But Solara understood something that Vex did not. The Void Heart was not actually a weapon at all. In her merged state with access to ancient knowledge, She could see the truth that had been hidden for millennia. The crystalline fragments were pieces of a seal, a lock that the first brood had created to contain a tear in reality itself. On the other side of that tear was the void, a hungry dimension of pure nothingness that had consumed an entire previous civilization before the dragons learned how to cage it. The Crithians thought they were assembling a superweapon, but they were actually breaking open a prison. If they succeeded in bringing all the fragments together and activating them, they would not destroy their enemies selectively. They would open a gateway that would consume everything indiscriminately, spreading outward until nothing remained anywhere. The void did not distinguish between friend and enemy, between worthy and unworthy. It simply erased existence itself. Solara had to stop the activation before it was too late. She directed half the assembled dragons to attack the Crithian positions on the ground, while the other half flew upward toward orbit to intercept the ships retrieving the fragments. The dragons responded instantly to her commands, moving as one coordinated force despite coming from different worlds and having never fought together before. On the ground, General Theron watched in horror as his careful plans collapsed around him. The elven soldiers who had remained loyal to him were now deserting, realizing they had been manipulated into helping destroy their own people. Theron fell to his knees, his face showing the weight of his betrayal. He had genuinely believed he was doing what was best for the elven race, but his pride and prejudice had made him easy to deceive. Admiral Vex laughed at Theron's despair and activated his weapon. The energy cannon fired a massive beam directly at the temple doors, blasting them open and exposing the chamber beyond. Inside, the final void heart fragment sat on an altar, pulsing with dark energy. Vex ordered his remaining soldiers to retrieve it immediately, so it could be transported to the fleet for assembly. But Solara and Ember descended from the sky like a meteor, landing between the Crithian troops and the temple entrance. Solara no longer needed her wheelchair because she was no longer entirely physical. The merger had transformed her into something between mortal and spirit. Sustained by Ember's energy and the combined will of all dragons, she raised her hands and waves of fire erupted from the ground, forming a barrier that the enemy soldiers could not cross. Admiral Vex activated his personal shield and walked through the flames unharmed. He told Solara that her resistance was admirable but ultimately futile. His fleet had already collected the other fragments and was preparing to bring them together. The activation would happen whether she stopped him here or not. He suggested she use her remaining time to say goodbye to her friends rather than dying pointlessly. Jake had been watching from behind cover while coordinating the resistance fighters. Now he stepped forward with the device he had been building secretly during the battle. It was a modified version of the resonance beacon technology the Crithians had used, but Jake had reversed its function. Instead of tracking the void heart fragments, it would disrupt the energy signature they emitted. If he could get close enough to activate it, he might be able to prevent the fragments from properly connecting. Solara sensed Jake's intention through their deep friendship and the enhanced awareness the merger gave her. She created a path through the combat zone, using dragon fire to clear away enemy soldiers. Jake ran forward with Linda and several other resistance fighters protecting him. They fought their way toward the temple while Solara held Admiral Vex's attention. The Admiral realized what was happening and tried to stop them, but Solara would not let him pass. She and Ember worked together in perfect synchronization, breathing fire and using ancient magic that had not been seen in thousands of years. Vex's personal shield protected him from direct attacks, but it could not prevent Solara from manipulating the battlefield itself. She caused the ground beneath him to crack and shift, throwing off his balance and slowing his advance. In orbit above the planet, the dragons that Solara had sent were engaging the Crithian fleet. The ships had expected minimal resistance and were caught off guard by the sudden swarm of flying creatures that could breathe fire hot enough to melt through hull armor. Several ships were destroyed in the first few minutes of combat. Others tried to retreat but found their escape routes blocked by more incoming dragons answering Solara's call. Jake reached the temple chamber and placed his device next to the void heart fragment. He activated it, and immediately the dark pulsing energy began to stabilize and fade. In orbit, the fragments that the Crithian ships had collected started breaking apart, their dangerous resonance disrupted by Jake's interference. Admiral Vex screamed in rage as he realized his plan was failing, but then something unexpected happened. The void itself seemed to sense that the seal was damaged even if not fully broken. A crack appeared in space above the planet, a tear in reality that showed nothing beyond it. Not darkness or emptiness, but true non-existence. The absence of everything, including light and matter. The tear began to grow, slowly at first, but accelerating. Scylla understood with terrible clarity what needed to be done. The seal could not simply be disrupted or the fragments scattered. It had to be reinforced, made stronger than before, and the only way to do that was for beings of pure life energy to add their essence to it. Dragons were creatures of life and fire, the opposite of the void's nothingness. If enough dragons gave themselves to strengthen the seal, they could close the tear permanently. Ember communicated wordlessly with Scylla, expressing willingness to be the first sacrifice. But Scylla refused to let her friend die alone. They had been together since Scylla was young, and they would face this final challenge together. Through their merged consciousness, she asked the other dragons if they would join them in this sacrifice. Many responded immediately with acceptance, understanding that some prices were worth paying. Jake realized what Scylla intended to do and ran toward her, shouting her name. He begged her not to go through with it, saying they would find another way. But Scylla told him gently that there was no other way, that this was what she was always meant to do. Her exile and suffering had not been meaningless tragedy. They had been preparation, stripping away everything superficial so she could become strong enough for this moment. She thanked Jake for everything he had given her, for showing her that strength came in many forms and that broken things could still be whole. She told him to build the sanctuary they had dreamed about, a place where outcasts could find acceptance and purpose. She asked him to remember her not as the paralyzed elf who needed help, but as the warrior who chose to save everyone even at the cost of herself. Then Scylla and Ember, still merged as one being, flew upward toward the tear in space. Behind them came dozens of other dragons who had volunteered to join the sacrifice. They flew in formation, their scales blazing with light of every color. As they approached the tear, they began to release their life essence, pouring their energy into the damaged seal. The void tried to consume them, but dragonfire burned even in nothingness. One by one, the dragons gave everything they had, their physical forms dissolving as their essence reinforced the seal. The tear began to shrink, reality healing itself as the prison was made whole again. Admiral Vex and his remaining soldiers were caught in the backlash, erased from existence as the void briefly touched the physical world.